Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Patrice Petro and I'm director of the Carsey Wolf Center. Today we are really pleased to welcome Isabel Sandoval to discuss her 2019 film Lingua Franca, which she stars in, wrote, produced, and directed. Lingua Franca tells the story of an undocumented trans Filipina caregiver and explores issues of sexual identity and also the dangers of being an immigrant in Trump's America. As one critic has written, and I quote, as a director, Sandoval provokes strong acting from her entire cast and composes each scene impeccably. As a writer, her story reveals the indignities trans women and immigrants face. As an actor, her interpretation of Olivia is one of the most textured performances of the year. The sublime musical score is totally exquisite and underlines Sandoval's supreme taste. Isabel Sandoval will join PhD candidate Miguel Penabella in a discussion of this fascinating film. Today's event is part of a larger series at our center, as many of you know, spanning fall and winter quarters and entitled Subversives. The idea for the series was Miguel's, and I want to thank him for all of his creative ideas and hard work that made this series possible. I'd like to welcome Isabel Sandoval and Miguel Penabella to the screen.
Thank you
Thank,
so much, Patrice, for the introduction.
thanks again, Patrice. And thanks to everyone for attending tonight's programming. Once again, my name is Miguel Penabella, and I'm joined by director, writer, actor, and editor Isabel Sandoval. Welcome, Isabel.
Thanks, Miguel. So nice to meet you, and I'm very honored and delighted to be here this afternoon.
Wonderful. Well, the first question I had is regarding the film being set specifically in Trump's America, right? And his immigration policies play a very major role in this film. How does his administration inform everything from the story to the mood of Lingua Franca?
Certainly, I've said before that it's not an autobiographical film, although both Olivia, the main character, and I do happen to be, Filipina trans women immigrants living in New York City. But when I started writing Lingua Franca around 2015, it was more of a straightforward romantic drama where Olivia becomes involved with a cisgender man who isn't initially aware that she's trans. But halfway through writing the script was when the 2016 presidential election took place and Trump got elected. And like a lot of minorities living in the US, I felt like I was plunged into a kind of emotional and existential crisis where, especially during the first 6 months of his administration, it was akin to going through the different stages of grief in a way. And I was feeling especially vulnerable and tense and was feeling a lot of uncertainty about my predicament. And the mood and atmosphere of Lingua Franca is really me channeling my emotional state around that time. So that whereas before it was a romantic drama, it's now more of a romance tinged with unease and anxiety. So the Trump administration was this definitely kind of a major looming presence in the story.
Mhm. And, I like that you mentioned that, you said that the film isn't necessarily autobiographical, but it is personal. And you've also mentioned before in previous interviews that you were building upon anecdotes from those that you know. So how did those lived experiences, how else did those shape the film?
Yeah, the anecdotes that I got that inform certain scenes or certain character arcs in Lingua Franca are from good friends, actually. I have a few friends who also are in the same boat in terms of arranging, green card marriages.
Mhm.
And these are not just necessarily like Filipina, but, friends from different countries, in Asia and Latin America. And I also did have friends who had grandparents who were suffering from dementia. And in fact, the early scene in the film between Olga, who was peeling an orange in the kitchen, and she calls Olivia as she's doing laundry in the basement, is directly inspired by an experience of a good friend of mine. So these anecdotes kind of make up the composite of Olivia's experience. And then I throw in also some aspects of my own personal life. I feel like the phone calls between Olivia and her mother in the film are lifted verbatim from my own conversations with my mom, and I didn't even realize it until I was editing the film. So yeah, it's a combination of all those things, but they're definitely lifted from personal experience, both mine and people that I'm close with.
Mhm. So this screening series is themed around cinematic subversives. I chose this film and I considered it subversive for the emotional complexity of its trans characters, which is pretty unfortunately rarely depicted in mainstream cinema. Well, I was curious about, what do you see as subversive in your filmmaking, and how can filmmakers be subversive?
Thanks for catching that and you know, bringing that up, Miguel, because I really do think a story with a subject matter told this way is very much subversive in that, based on its premise, you would expect more of a textbook social issue, melodrama, or, but, and given a subject matter which touches on topical themes like immigration, the trans experience in the US, and the current administration, you would expect a film that would be maybe didactic or preachy and a little loud and performatively agitated and angry. And some films, do have a right to be that, but my approach is in a certain way the opposite extreme. I'd like to think that I made a film that's patient and quiet and very nuanced and thoughtful, and that I hope encourages critical thinking that way. And I also set it up in a way that narratively you would think, for instance, that it's gonna resort to typical tropes about, that are common in feature films that feature trans characters, where they're, especially trans women of color, where they're subjected to physical violence. But here, violence does still exist and happens to Olivia, but it is a more insidious nature because it's emotional and psychological, as when Alex gaslights her. And it's also not the kind of violence that is, you know, just unique to trans women, but it's something that happens in relationships where there's a power differential, in terms of gender, for instance, or citizenship status. And it's subversive as well in the way that it doesn't dwell on an aspect of the trans experience that a lot of films by cisgender and male directors tend to focus on, uh, which is the gender transition, which becomes so sensationalized. And here in the film, the story starts, well after Olivia's gender transition, and I don't really make much of an issue about her being trans. Like, the film is not about Olivia being trans. She just happens to be trans and Filipina and an immigrant, and there's an actual story that takes place. And in fact, the first act of the film is very naturalistic and immersive, in that we're just observing Olivia go through her daily routine and her daily rituals, looking after Olga.
Yeah, you've spoken before about representations of trans women in Philippine cinema specifically. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the context for those who might not be as familiar, and maybe speak a little bit more about how your approach is different, right, compared to that.
Certainly, growing up, and I think this has a lot to do with why, and not to get too personal, like why it took me a long time to figure out and realize that I was trans. And I didn't realize it until after I moved to the US, because growing up, the depictions of trans women in Philippine film and media is very caricaturish. You know, they're almost always the butt of jokes, and these are very like flat, one-dimensional depictions where the trans woman is portrayed as being a flamboyant boy chasing clown. And you know, I never identified with that. uh, Even as a kid though, I did identify with women role models, but these are women who are intelligent and strong-willed and headstrong as
Mhm.
well. And I wrote Lingua Franca, and especially Olivia, that way I did to be a corrective to those portrayals that I saw growing up of trans women in Philippine cinema, especially in that I'd like to think that Olivia here is a layered, morally complex
Mhm.
character, and that we're also seeing multiple facets of her. You know, she can be tender and caring, but she can also be, you know, angry and resilient and sensual. And
I'm glad you brought up that sensuality because that's a good segue in my next question, which is that I thought one of the most striking features of the film was just how sensual it was, right? You give Olivia moments of sexual desire and fantasy and pleasure. And I've heard you refer to the term trans female gaze as a one way to describe your approach to this. How does that trans female gaze operate in your film?
I, my own definition of a trans female gaze is having the trans woman be the active agent of her, you know, of desire, of sexual desire. I think, and not just with the trans female gaze, but with female gaze, you know, as a reaction to cinema in general being predominantly male gazing, and that the woman, aside from her being a passive object of desire as represented by the camera and how the woman is the female character is shot and lensed in the film, she never really becomes an active agent, you know, and of her desire. And the two central scenes in the film, one is a fantasy scene, which, you know, it's really about her just allowing herself and permitting herself to have this sensual fantasy. And the second, more, you know, traditional, so to speak, sex scene is not even just a succession of shots of body parts and naked bodies gyrating against each other. And I know that there is a kind of fixation or obsession over the trans body, the female trans body in particular. But I wanted it to focus just on her face and her eyes, really, as Olivia slowly yields to, you know, sexual pleasure, as she's also processing the fact that she's becoming intimate for the first time with a man that doesn't know yet that she's trans, and weighing the risk of exposing herself, you know, to the potentiality of physical danger. And I think what's most affirming about that scene is that ultimately it's a scene of her thinking and of us seeing her thinking. And I think seeing a woman character think, and a trans woman of color immigrant at that, that's usually deemed invisible in American cinema. And to see that woman do that, to think, I think it's such an assertion of selfhood and agency that, you know, I just thought I had to have that scene there. And in fact, in a way, I can say that I wrote those two scenes first and then wrote the rest of the movie around that.
What are those thoughts that are racing through her mind during that moment?
And it's actually those that second scene, that sex scene, that felt very personal to me, because I've certainly found myself, in a situation like that before. And when I shot that scene, I never really acted all that much before. Like, this is my first role after my gender transition. And we shot this sex scene on the very first night of the shoot, just because I felt like, oh, I'm gonna prove myself and show my crew and these people that I can do this thing. So yeah, it's a combination of being Olivia and finding herself in that situation, and also being Isabel and realizing that I'm being, captured in front of the camera in a way that's very exposing and very vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, there is an intersectionality of experience here, both yours and Olivia's.
Mhm.
There's the experience of diaspora, specifically of an undocumented immigrant. And how does that intersect with the experience of being a trans woman in the film?
Yeah, I consider them, the intersection is, I think, the notion of a peripheral existence, living kind of outside the margins. And as a trans woman, conventional, like, gender norms, and as an immigrant and an undocumented immigrant, being in the margins of legal, quote unquote, citizenship status. And my approach to character, I was actually shocked that, people find the film to be unusually or exceptionally perceptive and cognizant of intersectionality. And because, but it came naturally to me, because my approach to characters in my old films is that they're very much influenced by their milieu, and as someone who does not have the privilege in terms of, gender or race, for instance, I'm keenly aware of the privations of that, and these, matters of race and gender and citizenship status inevitably and naturally emerge in how I write characters in situations, especially for a film like Lingua Franca. Like, it's not something I can't deny, like a white cisgender person in their own stories. Like, this is a reality that I feel most palpably, especially in the cultural environment that's being fomented and fostered by the Trump administration.
Right. Actually, I wanted to talk about Olivia's role as an OFW specifically, like an overseas Filipino worker, for those who are not familiar. Her role as an OFW is pretty central, but it's something I actually don't really see discussed in some of those interviews. But I was curious about how her OFW identity shapes the story, and what are those kinds of class issues that are at play?
Yeah, it was intentional for me to write her as an OFW and a caregiver in particular, because this is a common situation for a lot of Filipino immigrants in the US. And I feel like it gives the audience an entry point to someone like Olivia, but also goes deeper because of that. And because it's such a common image that we see of Filipino immigrants in the US, I thought that it was an opportunity for me to both dignify and ennoble that subjectivity and that experience, in households with a caregiver and a Filipino caregiver, they're really considered, yeah, peripheral people and peripheral characters, so to speak. So that's how I think a film like Lingua Franca is radical and somehow revolutionary, because it takes a character that you can easily dismiss, you know, as being in the background, and putting her story and her experience front and center, and having the Caucasian cisgender characters orbit her and her story.
Right. I was also thinking too of the title of the movie, right? Lingua Franca, which refers to a common language between speakers of different native languages. Can you speak more about the significance of the title? I mean, what are the commonalities between Olivia and Alex, especially when so much of their interactions are about what's unsaid?
Yeah. Lingua Franca, of course, is the dictionary definition is bridge language, but I use the title ironically in the film because, as you mentioned, although they talk to each other and communicate with each other, in English, what is most important between them is what's left unarticulated and what's left unsaid. And it's also I think a commentary on my own evolving aesthetic and sensibility as a director, in that with each new film that I make, I'm becoming more of a purely visual storyteller, in that it's actually in the gaps, in the pauses, and the silences that the characters reveal themselves most fully and most honestly. And yeah, for a film that's called Lingua Franca, it's not a particularly verbose or dialogue-driven film, especially in the final stretches.
And it's not just Olivia and Alex that's a kind of relationship in the movie. There's also the two immigrant women at the heart of the story, Olivia and also Olga, right? Alex's grandmother. What are the parallels between those two characters?
Yeah, I wanted to, besides Alex and Olivia, I wanted to make a film that centered the experience of two immigrant women in New York City, and how, the populace of New York City is just a succession of generation of immigrants from different places. Olivia and Olga are mirror characters, and that they both migrated to the US at different points in their lives. And they are experience a certain sense of displacement. Olivia's is more obvious because she is a recent immigrant who happens to be without papers. So her displacement is political, while Olga's displacement is now more emotional and psychological, because she's kind of untethered from her memory, as someone who is suffering from dementia, and how they are in a way each other's lifelines in a very subtle way as this story unfolds, and as the film, as it progresses, becomes increasingly claustrophobic because of how, more strongly Olivia feels that ICE agents and the threat of deportation is closing in on her.
Right. In addition to kind of those immigration contexts, I also wanted to talk about the use of language, right? And I count 4 different languages spoken in the film: English, Tagalog, Cebuano, and Russian. How important was it for you to have this multiplicity of languages, and why?
Yeah, I wanted to make a New York film that more accurately reflected my own experience of living in New York City. And especially when you leave Manhattan and go to the outer boroughs like Queens and Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn, but for instance, when we think of Brooklyn, it's either a Spike Lee film, or more recently, we mostly see the hip, gentrified neighborhoods like Williamsburg, as featured in Lena Dunham's Girls. on HBO, but living in Brooklyn, it's really composed, it's very heterogeneous in that it's composed of different ethnic and immigrant neighborhoods that have a distinct identity and characteristic to them. Like there are communities of both Orthodox Jews and Hasidic Jews, as well as Caribbean and Jamaican neighborhoods. And Brighton Beach is only a half-hour train ride from where I live in Crown Heights, which is one of those more gentrified neighborhoods. But when I go to Brighton Beach, I feel like I'm being whisked off to a totally different place, and in some ways country, and a different time period as well. And I was actually, to be honest, I was inspired to set the story there because James Gray, who's Russian American, set a few of his earlier films in Brighton Beach, including Two Lovers with Joaquin Phoenix and Gwyneth Paltrow about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that setting, Brighton Beach, but then there's also another moment in the film, I believe, when she and Alex go on a date to a neighborhood in Queens, I think. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so that neighborhood in Queens is considered the Filipino neighborhood. It's called Woodside. And yeah, I mean, these are some of the details and narrative flourishes that I include in the film. That's also because that's also something that I do. Like I live in Brooklyn, but sometimes when I feel like having Filipino food, I go to Queens to do that. And yeah, it was important for me to kind of show a Filipina immigrant and her usual haunts in a place like New York City. And you asked about language in your earlier question, but I kind of did not address that. So I wanted to just talk about how important it was for me to open and close the film with Filipino and especially Cebuano voiceover, and how that Cebuano language juxtaposed with a montage of scenes set in Brighton Beach, which are quintessentially, American scenery. So I want to usher the audience into my film as the storyteller and telling them, you might think you're watching another American film or another New York film, but I am telling this from my own voice and my own perspective. And also, yeah, that's why I included both Russian and two Filipino languages, Cebuano and Tagalog, as well as English, to capture my own experience of living in New York City as an immigrant from the Philippines, surrounded by other immigrants.
One of my favorite moments of the movie is the poem that Olivia recites in voiceover.
Yes.
Can you talk about the significance of the poem? Where did it originate?
So it was inspired by a love letter from Vladimir Nabokov to his wife, Vera. And yeah, I feel like it's becoming part of my own style and creative and aesthetic predilections as a filmmaker. And that at first I was initially very resistant to voiceover, especially a narrative voiceover that just explains what's going on in the film that you can see with your own eyes. But now I feel like the way I use it in my own films, like a voiceover, can be very intimate, and that it can be a window to the mind and the soul, not to sound very like new agey, of a character, especially a character who is conventionally considered voiceless, or not really given the space and the room to reveal themselves. And yeah, I also thought it was quite interesting to have, even though it's read by someone, someone like Alex, he's reading a love letter addressed to his own grandmother, you know, and a woman, a septuagenarian, an octogenarian, someone who's in her 80s and experiencing dementia. And we're given a glimpse into her sensual life, you know, her inner sensual life. And for her perspective for the perspective to transition from hers to that of Olivia, a trans woman of color, you know. So yeah, and I thought I thought that love letter was perfect for the sensual fantasy scene that I wrote.
Yeah, I really love that scene. I love the exchange of glances that Alex and Olivia share um, when they have the letter. Another question I had was all about characters consuming media. We oftentimes see them, for instance, Olivia watching the news on television, or Alex listening to the news on the radio or the Joe Rogan podcast. How does media shape the politics of those characters?
Yeah, I mean, as I had mentioned earlier, my characters do not exist in a vacuum and are very much, if not a product of, they're influenced by their setting in the milieu and the things that that they're exposed to, including media. In Alex's case, the media that he listens to and that he consumes is a byproduct of his own upbringing, you know, and growing up in a neighborhood and a community that might be rather conservative and transphobic and, you know, homophobic, and the company that he keeps. So it makes sense for him to be listening to a radio program like the Joe Rogan show. And it also influences his how he reacts to discovering and learning that Olivia is trans, for instance. And Olivia, as much as she's trying to protect herself and cocoon herself from what is going on outside, it's inevitable. And this is especially true for a president like Trump, you know, who essentially has turned his administration into a reality series, you know, because that it's inevitable for someone like Olivia to be exposed to what Trump has been talking about and what he's been tweeting. And yeah, those little snippets of, you know, radio programs or TV shows that she sees very much are what darken her mind and her perspective of her own situation as she becomes more paranoid about what's going to happen to her.
I've read before that you were influenced by slow cinema in developing this film. How did slow cinema shape your work?
I think, especially once I hit, you know, got to college, my taste in film has just gotten less commercial and more art house. And that I didn't go to film school, but my own film school was getting my hands on works of world cinema, you know, by auteurs like Ingmar Bergman, for instance, Michael Haneke, Wong Kar-wai, and other Asian auteurs like Edward Yang, for instance, where there's just patience and the willingness to observe characters as they're living their lives in a patient and unhurried pace. And even in my own films, that's influenced how I cut my films, because I edit my own films, in that there's just something very immersive and absorbing about observing a character in their own habitat, even without dialogue. I think that can be even more revealing about, you know, what a character is like and what they're thinking uh, despite there not being dialogue, and just in the fact that we are seeing them be themselves. And this is how it was in, I think, the early part of Lingua Franca, both in Olivia as she's going through her routine, and even with Olga, you know, as she is peeling that orange. And that was also influenced by the cinema of Chantal Ackerman, especially both Jeanne Dielman, her masterpiece, and News from Home.
I thought about News from Home a lot, the opening and closing, where you have that voiceover and it's set to images of New York and she's communicating with her mother. What drew you to that in making this film?
Yeah, it's funny because the film had a different beginning and ending, and it was only in post-production while I was editing the film that I thought this ending doesn't, you know, this beginning and ending doesn't work for the film. And I talked to my producers and insisted that I want, you know, 2 additional days to do a pickup shoot. And that's when we shot those, you know, montages at the beginning and ending. And I was just drawn to the dissonance between the remoteness, seeming remoteness and impersonal nature of the imagery versus how intimate and in a way voyeuristic and personal the voiceover is. And that's also something that I cultivate in my own work, that tension, you know, and that contrast between the image and what you're hearing. Like halfway through the film, if you remember, and I cut it right in between, right in the middle of the sex scene, it cuts from the sex scene to an extreme wide shot of Olivia standing in the subway. And the camera very slowly zooms in on her. And then we hear essentially their pillow talk, you know, in a very bedroom come hither voice. And they're you know, she and Alex are talking about a very, very intimate thing. It feels like we're eavesdropping on this post-coital conversation as we're seeing her from afar. And I'm trying to create a mood of, yeah, that sense of paranoia and claustrophobia as the real world, the outside world slowly closes in on her.
You mentioned before too that you didn't quite have a film background, and I actually read that your background actually included receiving a master's in business, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So what was the motivation for the switch in career paths?
I've always wanted to be a filmmaker ever since you know, even as a kid, I was a creative person, and my natural creative outlet was filmmaking, in that I would not necessarily, you know, think of words on a page or a script, but I would imagine and visualize scenes that I cut together to form a film. But, you know, growing up, I thought for a long time that filmmaking was not a grown-up career, you know, and, you know, it's kind of hit or miss. And there are a lot of aspiring filmmakers that, you know, don't really, you know, make it. And that can be a very frustrating thing. And I felt that pursuing a business degree, and while I did pursue a business degree, I specialized in both marketing and media entertainment. And I had one foot in the door, so to speak, in the entertainment industry. And in fact, I had internships with in the international distribution departments of Focus Features the year after they put up Brokeback Mountain, and also the Weinstein Company, well before, you know, the big scandals and accusations of the sexual abuse going on. But I but after I finished business school, or a year or two later, I decided I wanted to take a plunge, and that it's something I would forever regret if I didn't pursue my passion. And I did. And now 3 features I'm vindicated in that my choice to pursue filmmaking has paid off, gratefully, and it's something that I'm very thankful for. As of a few months ago, after the film premiered on Netflix in North America and was acquired by Ava DuVernay's film distribution collective Array, I'm now being repped by a major agency as a writer director. So I'm very grateful for that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You've spoken to many times about your role as an auteur, and I'm curious about that thematic or stylistic through line across your 3 feature films. What kinds of, I guess, what is your auteur mark do you see in your features from Senorita to Apparition to Lingua Franca?
Thematically, John Cocteau, the iconic French filmmaker, once said that directors make the same movie over and over again, and that we constantly revisit the same themes, issues, and perhaps unresolved conflicts from our own personal lives in the movies that we make. It's just that, the more work we put out, our style becomes more sophisticated and elegant. And so thematically, I think my go-to theme is women with secrets, and also specifically a subset of that is women who are marginalized in a certain way, who are forced to confront very personal dilemmas in their own life within a fraught socio-political setting. And this is true and consistent across my 3 features. My second feature, Apparition, which I did right before my gender transition, was about cloistered Catholic nuns in the Philippines in the early 70s during the height of the Marcos dictatorship. And I consider them marginalized characters because when you see Filipino films that tackle martial law, they never really talk about the experience of nuns at that time, or the religious women in particular. But then in 1986, when I was, just very, very young, I remembered one of the very first images that I remembered was nuns marching in the streets, Filipino nuns marching in the streets, facing down military tanks and offering flowers to the soldiers. And so, Apparition was a fictionalization of how, in my mind, nuns that are pretty typically considered very docile and subservient in Philippine culture, how they went from point A to being, actively involved in politics and militant in that way. Yeah. So thematically, that's my go-to theme, and stylistically, and this is after Lingua Franca, I'm now drawn to the sensuality of an image and how, and not just, sensual scenes per se, but I'm intrigued and I'm interested by how I can make an image seductive, through colors, for instance. And yeah, I kind of experimented with that in Lingua Franca, in that it's, instead of a film that's just grimy and gritty throughout, there are some scenes that are quite lyrical and poetic and sensual.
Yeah, that's a good segue actually to some audience questions that we'll now be taking from the Q&A function on this webinar. So these questions have been selected by the Carsey Wolf Center staff, and we'll try to get through a number of them right now. One of those questions was about how you worked with your director of photography to develop your distinctive color palette. and your lighting design.
Yes, my cinematographer, Isaac Banks, is amazing. We very early on, and it was actually the very first creative partnership I had with Lingua Franca. We met 3 years before we started shooting the film, and as the script has evolved, I also, we talk a lot about how to shoot the film. But as with any independent production, as much planning as you like to do, you have to be flexible and adapt. And because there are just so many unknown variables and curveballs that get thrown at you. And in fact, there were a number of key locations in the film that we did not confirm until the very day before, including the slaughterhouse of all places. So yeah, I gave him a few references and pegs, Cinema with Chantal Ackerman, Wong Kar-wai, In the Mood for Love, and yeah, with those references in mind, Isaac strategized a visual design for the film and made sure that even though I'm throwing him, different influences that might be radically different from each other, like Wong Kar-wai and Chantal Ackerman, to have the visual language be consistent and coherent, from the start of the film to the finish. So much credit is definitely due to Isaac.
There were a few audience members too who expressed interest in the film's ending, and in particular, Olivia's decision to leave Alex and her job. Can you talk more about your choice to end the film as you did, and maybe alternatives that you might have considered? I think you also mentioned.
Yeah. I wrote the ending, I wrote the part that Alex gaslit Olivia pretty late in the screenwriting phase of the film. But when the moment that I wrote that, I could not think of any other ending to the film than the one that I decided with. And it's also, I think, it's at that moment when she makes a decision that would seem impractical and counterintuitive and, quite frankly, stupid, to some outsider eyes in her situation. Like, why would she, turn him down when this would be an easy way out of her predicament? It's at that moment where I invite the audience to really put themselves in Olivia's shoes and think, why did she decide that way? And it's also at that moment in the film that when the audience truly emphasizes with her, they're gonna see her as someone who's not just a trans woman looking for love or an undocumented immigrant looking for a green card. She is someone who's more complex and complicated and multidimensional than that. And I know that ending can be polarizing and divisive and also confusing to some people, but I did not want to make a film that would easily and neatly resolve Olivia's dilemma, in a 90-minute film, so that the audience can feel better about her and themselves and leave her story. Because at the end of the day, even though it's a story about this specific character, the bigger issue of immigration and trans women of color in the US remains unresolved. And I wanted to make a film that haunted and lingered with people, and that they continue to think of Olivia and someone like her and her plight long after and days after the credits have rolled.
I think I read in an interview that you had done that you really pushed for more scenes that were in Tagalog. Like, I think there was the scene at the church between her and her friend. Can you talk more about the importance of that?
Yeah, I mean, that happened actually, and that decision came in post, because initially Olga's character had more of an arc, you know, as a plot. As you'd mentioned earlier, Olga is an equally important character in the film, and her arc, you know, dealt more in alluding to her past as someone who's experienced the aftermath of the Holocaust in her home country, Ukraine. But when we shot those scenes, it didn't quite meet my expectations dramatically. So as an editor, putting on my editor's hat, I thought this would be an opportunity to instead develop the relationship between Olivia and Trixie more, and to highlight a relationship between two transgender Filipino women, Filipino immigrants in the States, and to have those scenes set in a church, because I also wanted to show, apart from, you know, the sensual life and the inner sensual life of the Filipino trans woman, I wanted to show her spiritual life and the friendship between these two women.
Can you talk more about Olivia's relationship with Olga too? A few audience members were commenting on how touching that relationship was. What did you want to emphasize about Olivia's work as a caregiver?
Yeah, I think the film is quite narratively sparse in that it doesn't really explain too much or a lot about the relationship, but I focus on essential scenes like the early one in the kitchen between them. And I think also because, you know, interestingly, by not overwriting and really spelling out those scenes, the reason why the scenes can be moving to certain viewers is that they can bring their own emotional experience to that, you know, looking after a parent or an elderly relative who might be in the same condition. And yeah, we all have families. We all had parents who might have needed us to look after them and care for them. And that's what I try to do, in that, to essentially write maybe not just an outline, but give certain characters enough definition and enough development, but also not to overwrite them, so that the audience are able to, by filling in the blanks about the relationship between characters, they're able to draw on their own memory and own personal experience.
There were a number of Filipina students in attendance tonight. So how do you hope that this film will impact those Filipinx audiences?
I hope that it emboldens and inspires people to go out there and tell your own stories. You don't need to have the highest budget or the biggest stars, and you don't need to have, you know, include tropes, you know, and conventional bankable elements in your film just to make it feel valid and important and necessary. You know, sometimes you just have to have the audacity to believe in the validity of your own voice and your own story. I never expected Lingua Franca to resonate with as wide a swath of an audience, both in the US, in the Philippines, and internationally as it did, because, you know, it can seem quite personal and idiosyncratic, and it's not the most commercial film, but because I just wanted to tell a story that came from a place that was authentic and uncompromised and undiluted, that its specificity somehow makes it universal.
And finally, can you tell us anything about your upcoming projects so that we have that on our radar?
Yes, I am writing pilot for a TV series for a cable network. And I am putting the finishing touches on my next feature script entitled Tropical Gothic, which is set in the 16th century in the Philippines about a native, this is very early on in the Spanish colonial regime, and it's about a native priestess who pretends to be possessed by the spirit of the dead wife of her Spanish master to avenge the fact that she's been dispossessed in the hands of the Spanish. And it has shades of Vertigo by Hitchcock.
Mhm.
And this is an ambitious and very risky film for me because, also aesthetically, I'm experimenting and trying out something new in that while a lot of my previous films are rather social realist in orientation, here I explore surrealism and magical realism.
Well, great. I'm very excited for it. I'm
Thank you.
also very thankful for you for sitting down with us this evening, and I'm thankful for everybody else for joining us tonight. The Carsey Wolf Center series on subversives, it continues throughout this winter with a discussion of Salt of the Earth on the 21st, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here tonight.
Thanks again, Isabel.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.